My guest today is Dr. Siddhartha Mukherjee, Pulitzer Prize-winning author, well-known oncologist, and one of the foremost public intellectuals and thinkers of our time. He is in India to address the Deepika Padukone-led Live, Laugh, Love Foundation that shines a light on mental health. Mental health is something that is close to Siddharth's own family history and something he has spoken and written about with extreme intimacy and candor. Siddharth, welcome to the show.
Thank you for coming.
Cancer and mental health have, in a sense, been the twin obsessions of your writings, of much of your work, of much of your medicine research as well. I want to start by asking you whether you think that writing your two books, The Emperor of Maladies and the book you wrote on the gene and intimate history, have made it easier, have changed responses to mental health in a country like India, where this conversation remains extremely stigmatized even now.
Well, I think the books allowed me to understand. I'm an oncologist. I'm not a mental health professional, but certainly there's been many issues of mental health in my family and my family's history, which I've written about. I think that conversation around mental health issues is increasing. Part of my sort of understanding of all of this grew out of how cancer awareness grew and became a big movement, a campaign in the history of the United States and other places. Mental health is going through some of this process itself, the destigmatization, the first time that people are talking more openly about it. 50 years ago, people wouldn't talk openly about cancer. So there are some very broad parallels between what is going on socially and politically in cancer, and also socially and politically what's going on in the world of mental health.
I do want to first talk a little bit about the mental health issues, because you're right, you're an oncologist, but some of your most intimate accounts have been about your family's struggle with mental health, your uncles, your cousins, and at one point your sort of mortal fear that this was genetic, it was predetermined, it was something that would in a sense reside in you and pass on to your children. Can you speak a little bit about your struggle and why you then decided to write such a personal account in a public domain?
Well, one of the things that's becoming very clear about some forms of mental illness, such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, both of which run in my family, one of the things that's becoming very clear is that these are both genetic and environmental diseases. By genetic, I mean we now have begun to understand very clearly that there are multiple variations of genes that contribute. You can inherit these from your parents. There's no one gene or one gene for either schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, but I would say that if you inherit a bunch of, a combination of genetic variations from your parents, you have a heightened risk. But even that doesn't complete the risk. You have to have environmental factors, we now know, that even make the disease fully manifest itself and themselves. So I knew I knew that I carried risk, because this was in my family, it runs through families, and I wanted to, and I had experienced it, so I wanted to write about it almost as a mechanism of understanding myself. How it had impacted my own life, and really explaining to others how deeply and how consequentially genetic variation can have a very important role in all of our lives. It's not some kind of abstract thing that happens to other people. Virtually every family has a history of some illness, and that illness again may have some genetic and environmental components. So I wanted to bring all of this out, and also be able to talk about this without shame or stigma, or without just say that this is part of your story, part of my story. And that's why the book is called The Gene and Intimate History. You could write a history of genetics without telling your own story. But the funny thing about writing such a history of genetics in which you don't tell your own story, it's like saying, on one hand you're saying this is about you, genes are about you, genes are part of what makes you, and yet the question then arises, well, where are you, how were you made in the context of your own personal genes? So as a writer, but also as a doctor, I wanted to sort of bring these two pieces together.
Now there are ethical questions thrown up by any debate around the kind of predeterminism that your genes may leave you with, and I have met medical practitioners even in India that are now talking about how diabetes can be reversed, that it is all in your genes. You know, it may be a little bit in your diet and your lifestyle, but it is also in your genes. And once this starts getting applied to more and more sort of ailments, and it becomes part of the sort of diagnostic process, are you concerned about a kind of new age eugenics? Are you concerned about a kind of new age racism, that this kind of science, if misused, could result in?
Well, so this science is always has the danger of being used and misused. We've seen many historical examples we've seen many historical examples of the use of science to save lives, to emancipate humans. You know, we are living, many of us have finally been able to live longer. Infant mortality has decreased dramatically in not only in this country but across the world. But also science has its misuses. Eugenics is the idea that you could use genes, or one would use genetic selection as a mechanism for determining the fate of your child. And eugenics is always threatening, especially in countries where there's a great premium placed on inequality, right? So, for instance, in India, there's a premium placed on being male or having a male child. And in fact, if you look in several parts of India, this is very well published data, the ratio of male versus female children could be as abnormal, it's usually 1:1, but the ratio of male versus female surviving children can be as skewed as 1 to 0.8. In other words, for every 10 men, or there are only 7 women children, surviving women children at least in adulthood. So that is a form of eugenics. Where did these children disappear? They must have disappeared somewhere. There was a genetic selection in that case. So I think the ethical concerns are absolutely there. One thing is that it turns out that most of the common human diseases are not diseases of one gene variant. So it's not as there's one gene for one disease. That's one point. And so selection, as it were, genetic selection, eugenics for these diseases is not simple. It's not simple to do because there are many gene variations. And the second point is that many of these diseases, not all, many of these diseases have a very important environmental component. So it's a little bit like you have the gun, but without the trigger, the gun doesn't fire.
So it's a predisposition.
It's a predisposition, not an absolute disposition. So, and it's a statistical disposition. In other words, I could say, there'll be 50% chance that you will encounter breast cancer in your lifetime. But it's very rare to be able to say there's a 100% chance that you'll encounter breast cancer in your lifetime. And that's because it's a combination, of course, of inheriting a gene in the case of familial forms of breast cancer and some environmental or chance component that we don't fully understand yet.
In that case, do you as an oncologist advise patients to do what an Angelina Jolie did, which is that you get yourself gene mapped and then you say, I don't even want to take X% chance, so I'd rather just have my breast removed?
So, as I said, in the case of breast cancer, there are risk genes. You can sequence them, you can find them in your body, and certainly you can find them in your family history. I'm only one of many people who advise such, men and women, because they meet genetic counselors, they would meet a psychiatrist or a psychologist at some point of time, they would meet with their oncologist, with me, and we offer them not advice but try to elicit what what they want to do. We offer them lots of options. For a woman with a higher risk for breast cancer, where we know the genetics is quite clear. We don't know for most breast cancer, but for some breast cancer we know the genetics is quite clear. We offer them advice that could range all the way from, well, let's wait and watch, to, let's try a medicine. There are medicines that will reduce the risk, to, more radical forms of therapy, such as bilateral mastectomies, and allow them to choose. We allow them to make the decisions themselves, because they have to ultimately make the decision themselves.
But apply that to, let's say, your own concern with mental health and your family's sort of genetic history with it. How did you deal with it? Did you say, I want to be gene mapped? Did you say, knowing maybe that there was no single gene, as you've explained, that could be a marker, did you still have that sort of maybe anxiety of being gene mapped and looking, using yourself almost as a, your own body as a laboratory?
Yeah, well, so I can say personally I have not been gene mapped, and that's for several reasons. Number one is, in fact, the genes for schizophrenia and bipolar illness are not very well known and still remain not very well known. They were certainly not known in 2016 when my book was finished, and they are, even in 2019, we're still discovering what their identity is. So we don't have any predictive way of telling, if a person would have a high risk for schizophrenia or not. So therefore I didn't feel as if the knowledge would be so clear. However, I should say that the anxiety still is very much an anxiety. Whether you know exactly what your genetic sequence is or not, the anxiety is very much.
How do you deal with it?
Well, I think I deal with it by monitoring and trying, first of all, trying to understand and thinking to myself, are we, first of all, I read a lot and try to see, is it time that we'll have begun to understand these genetic risks? But secondly, with illnesses such as bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, you can certainly sense symptoms. And I suppose I'm more acutely on guard or acutely aware of my mental state.
And if you feel yourself slipping into that space, do you sometimes?
I don't particularly. I think so far I've not felt myself slipping into that space, which is thankful. But I'm certainly aware that I have certain anxieties that if and when my mental state changes, is it because of just a chance event that's happening in my life, if I'm having a bad day or a good day, or is it because something is going on that predicts other things that will happen to my brain or in the future? So
gene mapping then, and I'm asking this because it's very important for our viewers to understand this, therefore I'm reiterating it. Gene mapping is not a common prescriptive advice for where science is today, because a lot of people may see a celebrity like a Jolie and say, okay, maybe we should do that too. And you are saying there are only certain kinds of diseases, of illnesses, of ailments where there can be a specific gene marker.
Right, that list is expanding.
Okay.
And as I said, there are some illnesses where the gene is very single-handedly responsible.
Can you give some other examples?
Sickle cell disease is one example. So in other words, if you inherit two variants, one from your mom and one from your dad, of the sickle cell anemia gene, it's a variation in a hemoglobin gene, then chances are that in your lifetime you'll get sickle cell. So that's basically one gene. You can sequence that one gene, you'll know immediately. Cystic fibrosis is another example. And in the case of breast cancer, there are some examples of genes where single gene mutations will or single gene changes will set you up at a higher risk for the cancer. For most other human diseases such as cardiac illness, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, obesity in the case of and even diabetes, some forms of diabetes, two things are true. They have a familial pattern. So many people in your family, not everyone, many people in your family may have the disease. In those cases, we are just beginning to find out that there's not one gene but multiple genes, hundreds, maybe even thousands of gene variants that contribute to the disease, and we can begin to ascribe risk to an individual patient. Right now, that set is quite limited.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about where we are in the fight against cancer. And I ask you this because in August I read an article in the Scientific American which actually looked specifically at your book, The Emperor of Maladies. And while it praised the book as a great work of journalism, it had one disagreement with you, and it said that you were too optimistic, and that if there had in fact been somewhat of a decline in mortality rate from cancers, this was in large measure to the fact that fewer people were smoking today, that smoking had in fact become mercifully stigmatized, and that in terms of scientific advances, this article argued there hadn't been that much. Where do you stand on that argument?
Well, I have many things to say about the argument. Number one is that the detection of smoking as a carcinogen is part of the success of the anti-cancer program. In other words, you can't say gosh, the cancer program has not been successful because smoking has solved so much. Smoking is very much part and parcel of the anti-cancer program. The identification of tobacco smoke as a carcinogen and our understanding of how you accumulate risk, who are the patients who are the greatest at risk, etc., has evolved very greatly and evolved very much because of the scientific methods that are part of the anti-cancer project. So the real criticism was not that, I think the real concern is not that science or cancer science has not had impact on mortality. It has absolutely had impact, but that cancer treatment,
yes,
not cancer prevention or cancer early detection, but cancer treatment has had very limited success. That is true for some cancers, but absolutely not true for other cancers. So even common cancers such as breast cancer, the mortality has decreased maybe in the United States, maybe 1 to 2% every year. Now you could say 1 to 2% doesn't matter, but it's cumulative. So over the course of about 20 odd years, 25 odd years, the mortality from breast cancer has decreased by about 20-25%. That's a big number. That has big impact. Now, in general, if you look at the history of diseases, so-called epidemiological history, treatment doesn't tend to have the most public health impact because a smaller fraction of patients are treated and a smaller fraction of patients then the disease can be prevented.
Yeah.
So for instance, if you look at the history of the decrease of deaths from infectious diseases such as cholera and diphtheria, etc., most of that decline has been because of public health measures, sanitation, hygiene, and vaccination, etc. It's not been because all of a sudden we found antibiotics. Now, would you say the antibiotics are useless? Absolutely not. They're very useful in case you, of course, have an infectious illness. So I think it's overly nihilistic and overly simplistic to say cancer treatment has not had any impact or minimal impact on the lives of cancer patients. But prevention has had the most impact and will hopefully continue to have impact. But there are cancers that we are being able to treat where the impact has been enormous. There have certainly been other cancers such as pancreatic cancer, acute myelogenous leukemia, where in fact we haven't been able to make any difference, really any substantial difference in the survivorship of some patients.
Talking about prevention as something that is working or has worked when it comes to cancer, there's been a lot of global focus, and I know you've done some research yourself on the links between diet and cancer. And you tweeted about this, you have a published paper on the ketogenic diet. It's much the fad right now in India and globally. And I think it's really important to explain in simple terms what your research found on the keto diet and any possible links with cancer or in terms of prevention or treatment.
So my work with the ketogenic diet in collaboration with Luke Cantley is quite restricted. It has nothing to say whatsoever about whether keto diets work, prevent or do anything to cancer by themselves. We discovered we were following a very important but very constrained, restricted question, which is that women given a certain kind of targeted therapy, women with breast cancer, began to become diabetic. And we wondered whether the medicine was making them diabetic, and if that consequence, diabetes, that was coming as a side effect of the medicine, the chemotherapy that they were getting, if that was contributing to their cancer becoming resistant. I liken this to the famous story of the woodcutter who sits on a branch and chops off his own branch. So in other words, your own body's response to the drug was chopping off your capacity to respond to the drug. Your own physiological response to the drug was cutting off your cancer's response to the drug, like the woodcutter cutting off his own tree. So the conclusion of this paper is that the ketogenic diet in combination with this drug,
not by itself,
is helpful in now making the cancer cells die, and hopefully, hopefully increase the chances that you will have a remission or a response to the cancer. Two important caveats. We talked about one already. The ketogenic diet by itself was not effective at all, or was in fact even worse on some cancers in animal models. So that's the first point to say. The second point is all of this is animal data with human cancers, but data generated with simple systems. So we have to do a human trial, and we're in the midst of doing a very large, and I would say very sophisticated human study to find out if the ketogenic diet in combination with this family of medicines will have a profound effect. We hope that will have a profound effect on cancer. Now, there is a separate study funded by the National Institutes of Health, which looks at the ketogenic diet by itself, first of all in preventing insulin resistance or early forms of diabetes in patients. So there is one study. There are other studies that are on their way, which will look at the impact of ketogenic diet on prevention of various diseases. These are all early in their
research.
Genesis and in their research. So I don't think we know yet firmly whether the ketogenic diet actually helps or doesn't help. We know that that people lose weight. We don't know if, because the diet is relatively high in fat and protein, particularly fat, we don't know what form of fat is healthy for patients, and we don't know what the effects are, for instance, on the heart, etc. Most patients, again anecdotally, will report losing weight, and their diabetes is often brought into control because the insulin the amount of insulin requirement is decreased. So that is, I would say there is evidence for that, there is evidence in the literature for that, but we need to run a proper study, hopefully a randomized crossover study, to understand whether patients should take it. So or humans should take it. So before these studies come out, I generally recommend that without the advice of your physician and guidance, that you shouldn't just try it by yourself.
So it's not a fad that you would personally apply to your own life?
I don't.
You don't?
No, I don't. I follow a relatively healthy diet. I do believe that that our society has excess carbohydrates, excess sugar, excess use of sugar, and that is one mechanism that is contributing to obesity, and in turn obesity is contributing to diabetes, especially if you have a family history of diabetes. I think there is a contribution link between obesity and diabetes, obesity and inflammation, and I should say obesity and cancer. So in general, I think
reducing carbs and sugar is a good idea.
Reducing sugar in particular is a good idea.
Now, where is sort of the new frontier of research with cancer? And I've been sort of hearing you speak a little bit about this, reading a little bit about it. Cell therapy. Can you talk a little bit about this? This is a space you're just getting into. You're bringing it to India, and I mean, I think we'd all like to know more.
Well, I think it's one of the most exciting frontiers for cancer treatment, is to take a person's individual immune cells and weaponize them. By weaponizing them, I mean you train the cells using gene therapy. You train the cells to kill the cancer, and these treatments have been extraordinarily successful for some diseases, especially blood cancers in the United States. So these are called CAR T cells. We'll call them CAR T cells. It's a long acronym, but these therapies have been extremely successful. They're difficult to make, they're difficult to regulate, they're difficult to keep clean. So we decided that, but they are life-saving. In the United States, these therapies can cost up from $300,000 per patient to $1 million per patient. It's obviously an incredible amount of money. We thought that we should, number one, provide these therapies in India for the first time. If we can, send satellites up, and if we can have one of the most successful software and tech industries, we can certainly provide this kind of therapy to very needy patients, pediatric patients, patients with terminal cancer. So we decided to create a new model in which I teamed up with several groups, but most importantly Biocon and Syngene, to create a completely new cell therapy facility and cell therapy unit in India. And we hope to be able to deliver these therapies to children and adults, as soon as possible, as soon as next year.
At more affordable rates than they're available globally?
We are highly confident that we will get more affordable rates because of the ingenuity of engineers here. We don't want to compromise the safety or quality, but we have to really take this very seriously. So the company is called Immuneel. It is a consortium. It is it's a mixture of investors, most of whom really believe that India should be like any place in the United States or in Europe where you can avail of the latest therapies. But in this case, we hope at least 1/5 or 1/10 the cost.
Very interesting, and that kind of makes me want to ask you where you come in on this whole debate in India. It's a fierce debate between sort of generic drugs, affordable on the one hand, and upholding sort of intellectual property rights on the other. How do you see?
Well, I think there is a life cycle that drugs should go through, in which they, for a while, the inventors should be allowed, and the pharmaceutical companies that took the risks should be allowed to recoup the risks. If we don't allow that, the cycle of innovation stops. The Food and Drug Administration last year in the United States approved 50 odd drugs. It's a record number. The year before that it was 40 something. The years before that have been in the 30s, etc. So we are at an accelerated pace, and that accelerated pace is a consequence of funded biomedical research, so basic research, and also of course clinical and translational research is a combination of those two things. But both of them require innovation. It's an innovation cycle that makes human medicines possible. If we stunt the innovation cycle anywhere, then of course we stunt the capacity to make new medicines. This is this would be obvious. But on the other hand, you also want these medicines to reach the human population. So the natural life cycle of a medicine should begin with the inventors, the people who put blood, sweat and tears into the birth of the medicine, to be able to recoup their investments, their personal investments, their lives spent. But over time, these drugs should and will become generic. India is very good at producing these generic versions, but the life cycle of a drug should be maintained, and it should be maintained in a thoughtful manner. Obviously, not allowing them to be patented forever, but also allowing the generics to go and further cheapen the costs of production.
One last question, a personal question. I read a really moving account by you of your father's last few days, and before you bring him home from the ICU, you described this almost chilling, sort of account of how you're moving him from one part of the hospital to the other, and as his sodium stabilizes, the doctors just say, we need these beds, there are patients in a line waiting for these beds, you've got to go to another part of the hospital, there's a rickety wooden sort of thing serving up as a stretcher, you're lifting it yourself with the assistant, getting him into some makeshift kind of ambulance. It was really disturbing to read this, yet this is the reality of Indians in healthcare, and I'm just wondering what that experience made you feel about the state of healthcare, public healthcare in particular, in the country of your origin.
Well, you see, the experience was like being on a roller coaster or a sine wave. On one hand, we experienced extraordinary care from doctors and nurses and all sorts of accessory staff. It was of extraordinary quality. It was based on reason, scientifically thought out, medically thought out, and clinically executed. So that was the sort of the peak of the roller coaster, and there were many such examples. A conversation with a geriatrician that was really very deeply thought out conversation. A conversation with his endocrinologist when his insulin and sodium could not be stabilized. But on the other hand, there were sudden failures. like like having a big rift in the middle, or a rut in the middle of these experiences as well, and almost all of them had to do with infrastructure. So you couldn't blame anyone. There was not a faulty person, there was a faulty system.
And a demand-supply mismatch.
So you go from the ICU, which where the level of care was of the highest caliber, but then you can't move the patient to a bed because the ambulance is broken, right? Meanwhile, extraordinarily high-tech instruments are being operated and understood at the ICU. That was the experience over and over again, that somehow the infrastructural components that keep medicine together, the glue that keeps medicine together, is often the place where the breakages are acute, and those breakages are just as dangerous to patients as not having an instrument in the ICU. And that's one of the things to recognize, is that medicine occurs, good medicine occurs in an ecology. If a nurse or a doctor or whoever it might be makes a chronic mistake, the entire, all the work
system
that's done
collapses.
So that was the experience, and it was also a learning experience for the United States. For my own work, what are the rifts there? Because of course there also are breakages of infrastructure.
Yeah. Well, Siddharth, the new research sounds in particular exciting, and I'm going to be reading up more on that. It's always a pleasure to have you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.